Benny asked me to do was to talk about demographic change in South Los Angeles for the last 40 or so years, to give you a profile of what's going on right now, talk about the opportunities for leadership. And if that wasn't enough, he also wanted me to comment on whether the Lakers would do well in the next season, whether or not the shoot down of the plane today was going to provoke war. I can't believe the range of stuff he wanted me to talk about. So what I am going to do today is talk a little bit about the demographics that have happened from the past to the present. Where are we right now? I'm going to assess a little bit of the current realities in terms of the challenges to the South LA community and Latinos in that community in particular. And then I want to suggest a really key future direction, that the development of Latino leadership in South LA is about learning to lead for everyone. It's learning to lead for the entire community, and that's going to be really the training task ahead. In doing this, we wound up defining South LA in a way that takes advantage of the way the census tract has done it, the LA Times has done it, and we wound up using a variety of data here. And essentially what we define as South LA, which is, you'll see in a second, important to realize is that there are many South LAs. There's a tendency, particularly if you're not from South LA, to say South LA, right? And for many people, what South LA means, black people, right? For other people, South LA, they just have no idea what it means at all. But in fact, there are so many different neighborhoods. Historic South LA, Central Alameda, where you grew up, Florence Firestone, the Vermont area, parts of South LA that are actually part of the county rather than part of the city, coming up to Leimert Park, Baldwin Hills, etc. And so what I want to do is talk a little bit about the demographic change, but actually break it down a little bit further and go into the neighborhoods. So let's talk about that demographic change. The big statistic that's probably the most striking to people is that in 1980, South LA was about 70% African American. In 1970, it was probably about 80% African American. By the most recent census, which is now they collect the census in a different kind of time period, so it's 2008 to 2012, you can see that what's happened is that South LA as a whole is now 2/3 Latino. So going from being 70% African American to 2/3 Latino, that's a very big change. And then we can take a look at how that's happened geographically. This is South LA in 1970, and the darker shades of the color mean a higher percent of the group that I'm talking about, in this particular case, non-Hispanic blacks. And you can see that in 1970, South LA was Black Los Angeles in two senses. It was the heart of Black Los Angeles. It's heavily African American. That darkest shade is more than 50% people of 50% African American. But the other part of that reality was that this community was very much kind of redlined into this community. It was very hard for African Americans to move to other locations outside of South LA. So this is what it looked like in 1970, in 1980, in 1990, right before the LA civil unrest, in the year 2000, and in the year 2010. So what you can see is a very dramatic change, but really that dramatic change has occurred mostly in historic South Central, down the Alameda corridor, the set of communities that are in the eastern part. African Americans have moved to the extent that they're in South LA into more Baldwin Hills, Leimert Park, Hyde Park, etc. And the real thing that's gone on is African Americans, it's not in the map, have jumped over into Hawthorne and Lawndale to a certain extent, and then have moved out to Palmdale, Lancaster, and the Inland Empire, which is one of the reasons why there's so many commuter churches here as well. So what does that mean in terms of Latinos? This is South LA in 1970. There were Latinos right near the university and in the Florence Firestone area, but pretty much almost no large significant Latino presence. This is 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010. So huge demographic change, but of course, again, that demographic change is mostly occurring in the New Ninth, right? In CD9 and in this part, and also in some of these unincorporated territories like Florence Graham, et cetera, Green Meadows. What's it look like in terms of whites? Here, the lighter shade means more white people. You can see that there were actually some in the Baldwin Hills area and by the university. And now they're just by the university, right? So I'll get to that demographic again in just a second. Another really interesting thing that people don't think about is that there was a significant Asian community. And some of you who are older here, you remember Dorsey High had a significant Japanese-American student body, etc. And so you can see that there were folks who sort of hadn't moved to Gardena yet, basically. And they're in the sort of northern part of South LA. These breaks are a lot lighter, a lot smaller, because the community was a lot smaller. But you can see that in 2010, there's small Asian communities kind of bumping up against where Koreatown spills over, but really this is an area that's become almost entirely black and brown. So when you break that down, what's interesting is the following. If you look at all of South LA, this is the graph we were looking at before, 70% African American in 1980, about 2/3, 63% Latino in the kind of most recent years. Basically, Watts is emblematic of South LA. That is, the demographics in Watts, the demographic change in South LA, watch that again, is basically the demographic change in South LA. That's why Watts is such sort of a bellwether for South LA in many ways. However, it's been a very different process in different communities. So this is historic South LA, which even by 1980 was 60% Latino, and you can see historic South LA is now 90% Latino. That's similar for Adams Normandy, big change, but retaining an African American community. Exposition Park, dramatic decline, but still has a significant African American community, but that's quite a big change. And that's also Central Alameda, which now is only 8% African American, 91% Latino. On the other side of South LA, this is View Park. And look at View Park. It was 82% African American in 1980. It's 79% African American in the most recent census period. So View Park is one of those places that's remained much more stable in terms of retaining its African American population. Lamert Park, similarly, though it's a growing Latino presence there. Baldwin Hills, and then this is the Manchester Square neighborhood. Again, significant African American community. And that's Gramercy Park. These are areas that are kind of experiencing more of the South Central average. That's Athens, and the Broadway Manchester, and then Vermont Slauson, again looking a little bit more like the overall thing. So one really crucial thing to remember here is there are many South LAs, right? It can't be reduced to one experience, and it can't, particularly the demographic change, which gets talked about very broadly, is being experienced very acutely and sharply along the Alameda Corridor. Historic South LA has a different set of experiences in other parts of LA, South LA. And then here, that's Florence, and then that's the University Park neighborhood, which has actually seen an increase in the number of whites, right? Those are our students. And a large number of Asian Pacific Islanders, those are also our students, right? Those are the huge influx of international students into the university area, and that influx has had a significant impact on housing prices, rents, etc., in ways that I know CD Tech, Sage, and others have been dramatically concerned about. Now, the other way to take a look at this demographic change, and I think it's really significant, is to look at children. And this is the number, this is the youth population, the numbers under the age of 18 by race and ethnicity in South LA. In 1980, there were about 63,000 young African Americans, young Latinos. By 2010, there's about a little bit less than 200,000 young Latinos in South LA. And South LA as a whole is about 650,000 people. Look what's happened to the African American youth population in that same period of time. So that population has declined dramatically from 140,000 in 1980 to about 60,000 in 2010. So while the Latino youth population is kind of stabilized, the African American youth population continues to be in decline. What that tells us is that the demographic change we've seen so far is going to continue to occur in this region. Another way to think about that, which is another cut on the data, is what share of the population by ethnicity is actually below the age of 18. So how youthful is the population? And what you can see there is here the non-Hispanic white data point is there, but there's not that many non-Hispanic whites. But if you look at the African American youth population, 32% of it was below the age of 18 in 1980. It's now about 24%. There's been a similar kind of size decline in the Latino youth population as a share of the population, but essentially you've got an older African American population, a much more youthful Latino population. So is that interesting so far? Okay. So another really important thing for people to realize is that when people tend to think about the immigrant population in South LA, they tend to think it must be very high because there's been this huge influx of Latinos. But the fact of the matter is that in 1980, South LA had much fewer immigrants than LA County, and now it's actually got less in, it's got slightly above LA County in South LA in terms of the share of the population that's immigrant. And what's also interesting about that is that the Latino immigrants who first moved into South LA in the 80s and 90s tended to be people who'd been here a longer period of time. Because the major reason they were moving in was to buy houses, and in order to do that, you had to have been in the labor market for some period of time, have some roots, be making a decision to buy a house. But really what's important to realize about this is that this Latino population, while there is this large share of immigrants, is also significantly US born.